Hello, I'm Steve Lusk from the Red Bank Church of Christ in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I'm bringing you today a lesson from a series of Bible studies in the Gospel of Luke that our church family has been looking at over the last few weeks. And today's lesson is from Luke chapter 16 through chapter 17, verse 19. We're looking at Luke not in a typical verse-by-verse way, but rather in sections especially that relate to discipleship. In fact, we're calling this series a Disciple Maker's Guide to Luke. It is an outline of Luke with discipleship in view. And so we're looking at selected passages, and today our lesson is entitled Discipleship and Stewardship. And there are three stories in this section that we would like to highlight. I'd like to read, beginning in Luke chapter 16, verse 1, the parable of the shrewd manager, or some call it the unjust steward. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot manage any longer. You cannot be my manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Then he asked the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in their dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trusted in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight." Now, as we look at this, I would like to just simply ask a few questions. And if you'd like, what I would like for you to do is I'd like for you to pause this video at the end of these questions. Maybe discuss these questions among your family or friends, whatever gathering you are at, and or just consider these questions and maybe do a little digging and studying of your own. So here's some questions about this. This is, first of all, a very puzzling parable. Most commentators say that this is the most difficult parable of Jesus to kind of figure out what it is he's saying. And now, just from my perspective, let me share that I believe the things that are said sort of after the parable help us understand what the parable was all about. Jesus is not advocating here dishonesty from in our stewardship and our managing of money, but rather he is challenging us to consider how it is we use our wealth as his disciples. So, I just ask you, what do you think Jesus is trying to emphasize in this puzzling parable? Also, think about his follow-up statements there. What do these statements say about our relationship to worldly wealth as disciples of Jesus? And then, why do you think that the Pharisees reacted to what Jesus said with sneering, the text says? And then, maybe a question for us to apply as disciples of Jesus. Why is it that we are challenged to avoid divided allegiance? Why does God want everything that we have as his followers? Consider these questions, and again, if you want to right now, just pause and look at these questions and discuss them among yourselves or ponder them for yourself. Now, the second passage that we want to look at is found a little bit later in Luke chapter 16, and it's the story, some say parable, and it really doesn't matter for our purposes if this is an actual story that occurred or a parable. That's another discussion for another time. But it's the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and it begins in Luke chapter 16, verse 19. I'll read it. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In hell, or Hades, torment, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And beside all this, between us and you there is a great chasm fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. He, that is the rich man, then answered, Then I beg you, Father Abraham, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not come to this place of torment. Abraham replied, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. No, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. He, that is Abraham, said to him, If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. Now, again, there are many interesting things in this story or parable, as the case may be, that relate to the afterlife. And I believe there are some powerful lessons that we can learn about the afterlife from this story. But that's really not the emphasis of our study for today. I want us to emphasize the last part of this story, that part where this conversation takes place between this rich man and Father Abraham, especially concerning his family back on earth. Why do you think that the rich man wanted Abraham to send Lazarus back to his family? And secondly, how did Abraham respond to this rich man? What does that tell us? What lessons may we as disciples learn from this about the importance of teaching other people, especially those with whom we have regular interactions? Now remember, one of our emphasis in this series of lessons is not only how to be a better disciple ourselves, but how to make disciples. So think about these questions in light of how can we be a better disciple maker. So if you want to pause the video right here and either ponder these questions for yourself and do a little bit more study, or if you want to discuss them in your family or small group, then this would be an appropriate time to do this. And then the third story that we want to look at is found in the 17th chapter of Luke, in verses 11 and following, concerning the healing of 10 folks who are afflicted with leprosy. Leprosy was a term that was used about any number of skin diseases, cancer type of diseases that may have afflicted people in Bible times. And it may not be the classic leprosy that we think of today, but it was used in a sort of a broad sweeping way to cover many diseases. Lepers were required to announce themselves. They usually lived in colonies isolated from the rest of society, the rest of a village or a town. Also from the standpoint of being ceremonially clean, or in this case unclean, they were not allowed to participate in worship in Judaism. So There were many reasons that this was difficult, just beside the physical pain and suffering that would ultimately lead to death. It was a death sentence to be a leper. So Jesus deals with these individuals beginning in Luke chapter 17, verse 11. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." Now, as we look at this particular story, what lessons should we as disciples of Jesus learn about gratitude from this story? Being thankful is so very important. And then, how does living a life filled with gratitude motivate you from day to day? For what are you thankful on a daily basis? It's interesting. This is at least the 6th time in the Gospel of Luke that a so-called outsider has been the hero in Jesus' interaction with people. For example, go back to Luke chapter 5. As Jesus was calling his disciples, one that he called was Levi, also known as Matthew, who was a tax collector. And there was no one who was more despised among the Jews than a tax collector. The thought that a Jewish rabbi like Jesus would call a tax collector to be his follower was scandalous. And yet that's exactly what he did. And Levi became one of his apostles. And then in chapter 7, verse 9, there was this noble Roman centurion who came to Jesus desiring something of him, healing for a family member of him. And of course, the great faith that this Roman centurion had was praised by Jesus. And again, the Jews despised the Romans because of their occupation of the Jewish territory and all the things that Rome oppressed them with, taxes and tribute payments and so forth. And so a Roman centurion is a kind of hero for Luke's gospel. And then also in chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, there is mentioned the love and the support, the financial support, that a group of women who followed Jesus provided for him. And of course, women were outcast in proper Jewish culture and were considered second-class citizens. And the fact that Jesus not only allowed these women to follow him, but received support from them, elevates the position of womanhood in Jesus' eyes. And then in chapter 8, verse 39, there's the strange story of this man who was filled with demons from the region of the Gerasenes, a Gentile region. And these demons were cast out of him, and he is found following or wanting to follow Jesus. And instead, Jesus says, "No, you go to your people and you tell them about the great things that have been done for you, to you." And so again, this Gentile that was outcast from society because of his demon possession, who was even feared by people, becomes a kind of hero in Luke's gospel. And then, of course, there's the classic story in Luke chapter 10 of the Good Samaritan. And I think most of us who've done any Bible study at all understand that there was this great conflict between the Jews and Samaritans, and there's a long history there that we don't really have time to get into. But the Jews and the Samaritans hated each other. And in this parable of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan becomes the hero who cares for a man and provides everything that he needs, and even promises to follow up and continue to provide for him. So over and over in Luke's gospel, we see these outsiders as the heroes in the stories that Jesus tells or the interactions that Jesus has with others. And so it is in this story that it is a Samaritan leper who comes back to Jesus and offers praise and thanks for what Jesus has done. And Jesus says, your faith has made you well, or literally whole. Not only was he physically healed, but then he was spiritually healed as well. And his gratitude demonstrates that healing. So I ask, in light of all these outsiders that Jesus reached out to, what message is Dr. Luke sending to us, his readers, about how Jesus reached out to people that we may even sometimes call outcasts, that were certainly called outcasts in his day? And is there a lesson for us as disciple makers that maybe we shouldn't just go to people that are exactly like us or that are socially acceptable, and maybe reach out to others who are sometimes overlooked, oppressed, and outcast in society? So I pray that today this Bible study from Luke chapter 16 and 17 will have encouraged you, will have empowered you, will have enabled you to become a better disciple, and would have challenged you to be a better disciple maker. I pray that you will ponder these questions, you will discuss them among your friends, and you will strive to be what God wants you to be. Thanks for listening, and God bless.